So now we're going to talk about inverse trig functions and what those graphs look like are exactly the same, or a piece of exactly the same as they did before. So except now the y values are the x values and the x values are the y values. So you may notice on the y-axis now it's negative pi over 2 and positive pi over 2. That's where the graph will start and end. And so that that range, we talked about domain and range a little bit. Now my domain, my x values, go from negative 1 to positive 1. It's not going to go any past that. So the domain is what the range used to be, and if these graphs continued in this wave-like pattern, so here's the wave, and then it goes down, up and down. So if it kept going over and over and over again, it would be like the sine graph is like this. If you can see on the video, it's doing the wave up and down now instead of side to side. So it's basically taken the graph that was this direction and shifted it this direction. So what you notice is this point here is 1 pi over 2, and this one is negative 1, negative pi over 2. So this point is 1 pi over 2, and then this is negative 1, negative pi over 2. Super janky way to write that, but that's okay. So 1 pi over 2 and negative 1 pi over 2, whereas before on regular sine, if we go graph that, we hide all of that. So here, this point, maybe I can get that to stay. So it's 1 pi over 2 and negative 1, negative pi over 2. But here, it was pi over 2, 1, and negative pi over 2, 1, negative 1. So those 2 points have switched places. Okay, those x and y values have switched places. So what was the x-axis is now the y-axis, and what was the y-axis is now the x-axis in the way that we're talking about things. So, oops, here we go. And so I also put on here quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. So what we're looking at here is the angle measures, so negative angle measures, negative pi over 2 or negative 90, anything between 0 and negative 90 would be in quadrant 4. Anything between 0 and pi over 2 or 0 and positive 90 would be in quadrant 1. And so when we talked about the calculator, when we did inverse sine in the calculator, when we were solving for specific things on quadrant trig, sine and cosine and tangent only live in specific areas. Well, sine only lives in quadrant 4 and quadrant 1 in the calculator. That's the only 2 angle measures that the calculator is going to give you. Same thing with cosine and same things with tangent. Except on cosine, if we switch over to cosine, cosine lives in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. And so these are all angle measures, remember. So from 0 to pi over 2, or 0 to 90, that's quadrant 1. And then 90 to 180, or pi over 2 to pi, is quadrant 2. And so in the calculator, when we're talking about those angle measures, it's only existing in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. Some of those values are positive. Some of those values are negative. Same thing here. Some of those values were negative. Some of those values were positive. And then if we look at tangent, tangent was going up and down, and now it's going to the right and to the left. So its domain is negative infinity to positive infinity now, and its range is negative pi over 2 to positive pi over 2. And so that's quadrant 4 and quadrant 1. So negative 90 to 0, that's quadrant 4, and 0 to pi over 2 or 0 to 90 would be quadrant 1. And so that's kind of where the calculator lives. I just wanted to give you some picture evidence of what that looks like in your in your calculator, because we kind of talked about the calculator a little bit, but it stops here at pi over 2 and doesn't go any past that because it doesn't need to. It gives you enough information in those two quadrants and you can figure out where those go. So that's why we add 360 to this one. That's why we don't add anything to that one, because that's perfect. And then when we're in quadrant, let's go back to our picture here. Looking at tangent versus arctangent, when we need to look at let's change that. When we need to look at, sorry y'all, there we go. When we need to look at things between pi over 2 and pi and 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi, like that's the rest of the unit circle if we're talking about angle measures, we can take this graph and we can just use those same patterns in the other quadrants. And so we don't need the whole picture. We can add 180 or we can add 360. So that's why we add 180 or 360 to those things. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense and you guys understand what the difference is between inverse graphs or inverse functions and reciprocal functions. So these are all angle measures. That's what we're solving for there. The answers to those, or the y values to those, are going to be angle measures. And then here it's just a completely different graph. It's a reciprocal function from sine and from cosine and from tangent. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys, and hopefully you enjoyed my first video.